Welcome back to the Change Physician Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Melissa Cady, joined by my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And we're here with our guest, Dr. David Draghinas, who is an anesthesiologist also. We got 3 anesthesiologists on board here. And thank you for joining us today.
Hey, I'm excited to be on the podcast and to chat with you all and share some of my experiences with you.
Great. Well, we always start off with the most basic of questions, and that is, why did you even go into medicine?
That is a great question. I wasn't one of those people who had a dream as a little kid to go into medicine. I went into college as a biomedical engineering major with a biochemical emphasis. I was really drawn into the whole biotech thing. I thought, going into college that I'd be working for Amgen or some such lab doing some kind of bio research. And initially, that's what I thought my path was going to be. But as I went into my years of college, I got to work in a molecular biology lab. And in that lab, I started to do some work with a neurologist. And this neurologist was doing some work with like trinucleotide repeat expansion diseases. It was bench research, but it had clinical implications. And as I spent more time in the lab, I had a couple realizations. Number one was that to do anything meaningful kind of in the biotech sphere, I would probably need to get a PhD. And as I was looking at the career trajectory of those in the lab that were PhDs and postdocs and things like that, I didn't see that as something that was appealing for me. And then this neurologist kind of became my haphazard mentor. He kind of took me under his wing. He started talking to me about medical school. And I remember something he said one time. He said, Dave, there's a specialty in medicine for every kind of person and personality. And that really kind of stuck with me. And so the experience in the lab doing the bench research, I enjoyed the research experience, but realized that that was not going to be my career path. And then speaking with this neurologist, he started telling me about med school and kind of encouraging me to do that. And being a bioengineer, I already had all the prerequisite classes. So it just became a matter of, in my third year, deciding, okay, I'm going to be serious about this med school thing. I probably need to prepare for this MCAT a little bit and probably not preparing as much as most of the pre-meds, but then, taking like a semester to kind of prep, take the MCAT, did reasonably well. And then, that was kind of the way my decision was made. And I was very idealistic back then. And I remember thinking to myself, when it's all said and done and I'm ready to retire, where do I think that I'll have kind of the biggest impact, for society, if you will? And I thought that medicine would be that place. And of course, I had no idea of specialty that I was going to choose or any of that kind of stuff. But that is kind of how it all unfurled for me.
So you switched your major, you had a physician mentor who sort of encouraging you, you enter medical school with this idea that on my deathbed, I will have made a difference through medicine. How did your expectations change, or did they change while you were in medical school? Like now you're in the thick of things. Did that kind of line up with what you thought it was going to be?
So I didn't even switch my major. I kept bioengineering as my major because I had all the prerequisites, and just applied to medical school, just kind of switched some of the things that I was doing in the latter half of undergrad as far as preparing for the MCAT and then the application process. But to get to the crux of your question, there was nobody in my family that was a physician. I didn't come with a whole lot of preconceived notions of what that was going to look like. So it was kind of like, it was kind of an open book. Let's just see what's going to happen. And what I would say is that, those first 2 years of medical school is pretty intense as far as, the amount of material, the volume of material that you have to cover. And so I went through the first 2 years just trying to absorb all of that information and, be the best student that I could be and learn the material as best as I could. And it was really in that third year that was probably another, I don't want to call it an inflection point, but you kind of have to decide by the end of your third year what specialty you were going to choose. And at the start of my third year, I had no clue. I had no clue if I was going to, lean towards surgery or family practice or peds. I thought maybe I'd like peds because I've always liked kids. But the one thing that I did that I thought was somewhat wise in hindsight was that I left. Every school is different, but with our school, you could choose to have kind of like a free block to do an elective. And I purposely chose to have one of these 6-week elective blocks towards the end of my 3rd year. And so my thought process was that if I kind of go through and do all my core clerkships, hopefully I'll have an idea by then, something that might be of interest of me, and I can, kind of try it out. And so what happened was, and Kevin, this kind of where our story starts to kind of dovetail a little bit. I was an HPSP scholar at that point. I was now, part of the U.S. Navy scholarship program. And so I selected an anesthesia rotation at Naval Medical Center San Diego towards the end of my 3rd year. And I had one friend who was in medical school a year before me. And so he now had declared into anesthesia, and I was asking him, why did he choose that? Why did he like that? Because I still wasn't sure. And he's like, well, I love the fact that you've got to know all this different kind of medicine. We work with peds, we work with pregnant women, we work with all sorts of patients, and we get to do some procedures, whether that's, intubations, lines, blocks, things like that. And I really like that hands-on aspect of it, but it's still very cerebral. And so I was like, well, I think I might like that. And so I chose this anesthesia rotation with the Navy at the end of my 3rd year and just immersed myself in it. And at the end of that rotation, I had decided that I was going to go into anesthesia.
So
funny. I just have to interrupt there because lo and behold, you will later be stationed there, which is where so we probably know some of the people that you rotated with.
And they were probably residents at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I think I did my rotation at NMCSD in my 4th year, and it was the same thing because then you get out of practice and I'm like, holy crap, you were a resident. You were like a 1st year CA1 when I was there. So, anyway, I had that. That's funny.
So how long were you dovetailing your lives together?
Well, we both ended up getting. I think Kevin, you're probably a year ahead of me, right? Because you finished your fellowship just as I was finishing my residency training, and we both started at San Diego as young attendings in like summer of 2007. Yeah. Yeah, and then I think we left at different times depending on our commitments. But we both came on board as new attendees. Kevin, of course, was fellowship trained in pain, and so he spent a good portion of his time doing that. I was a general anesthesia attending. So
you went straight into like a group practice after training, or were you still in the, how did your work look after you left residency?
Sure. So with the Navy, it gets a little bit complicated because I was an HPSP scholar, and the vast majority of people, once they finish their medical school, then go into the Navy, at least for their internship, and usually for some kind of GMO, General Medical Officer tour, if not like a flight surgery tour or something like that. And it's not a bad way to go. A lot of people like it because it's adventurous. It's, they get to do something else. Maybe they haven't figured out what specialty they want to go into. And so it gives them a chance to be kind of a general practitioner for relatively healthy military servicemen and women. And then they decide on their career a little bit later. I knew at that point, when I finished kind of that rotation and I was into my 4th year, I knew not only that I wanted to go into anesthesia, but I knew that if at all possible, I wanted to go straight through. And so kind of looking at the landscape, I knew that I would be a lot less competitive doing a Navy anesthesia residency just because there's a lot of priority given to prior service. So all of these men and women that were flight surgeons, that were GMOs, were gonna, kind of have first dibs on the more competitive residency spots. And anesthesia at that point had become a pretty competitive residency position. So I knew my chances were kind of low of going straight through. And so I applied for what's called a full deferment. And so I said, hey, Navy, I want to be an anesthesiologist. Let me stay on the outside. Let me train in a civilian program. And then once I'm done with my residency training, then I can come back on board and be an anesthesiologist for you and finish out my commitment that way. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate to get one of those spots. That they don't give too many of those out either. But luckily I was able to get one of those spots. And then I trained on the outside. I did my training at LA County USC. And then once I finished my anesthesia residency, now it was time for me to come back to the Navy and do my payback active duty time. And that's when Kevin and I meet.
I see.
in the summer of 2007. That was my first position as an attending outside of residency.
Well, that just goes to show you I'm a civilian and I didn't know how this all works. So.
It's a little complicated. It's a little complicated.
It's complicated just in medicine. I can't imagine layering on top the military stuff. So,
well, and then you add into the military experience the priors and the full deferments, because our office was 3 of us. We were all full deferment, so we were complete, not only newbies to the department, we were complete newbies into this whole military system thing.
Wow.
We had some fun though. That was a great experience. But,
yeah. So was there any particular once you're out, you kind of gave back your time, was there any rude awakenings or challenges that you found along the way that kind of made you realize the realities of the work you do or medicine in general?
Well, I think that, I think something that we realize as anesthesiologists that maybe other people don't realize is the amount of stress that you undergo, even when everything goes well, and I think that's hard sometimes for people to realize, like, well, that was a simple case. Everything went well. It's like, yeah, but I'm thinking about all the things that may not go well. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to react if they should happen. And so, that's something that I think you're not very well prepared for, like I remember my first days of residency, and especially your first days, like after I forget how long it was, but you kind of start out as a CA1 and they pair you up and there's an attending in the room the whole time. Man, I remember the first day or two when I was left in a room all by myself. Oh my goodness. I would come home at the end of the day and just feel like I had finished a marathon. I was just crashing. And it's because of, and that was in days when, there were normal days. And I think that's what it is. If you're a semi-conscientious person, when you're thinking, you realize that you have somebody's life in your hands. Mm-hmm. And the magnitude of that, when you're training and even when you're not training, because like you said, stuff can happen at any time, but having that weight on you, that's something that, you're, I think, ill prepared for if you're going into this field.
Yeah, there is a certain sense of, I think we normalize the stress. I think I recognize that same thing when I would go on vacation. Mm-hmm. And the night before I'd get this sense of like, not I wouldn't say fully nauseating, but this sense of like, oh, you just know that you're going to be at it again. And it's almost a sense of, because you have to have so much vigilance and it uses up so much energy, but it's so invisible to everyone around you. Even today, I was thinking, I have a patient who I'm doing a deep extubation on because they have some things done on their face and I don't want blood or anything. Mm-hmm. And then they're trying to clean them up in the middle of me trying to like do this, and I tell them,
don't do that.
Yeah, and I'm
don't
like,
touch the patient.
Yeah, and then I just turn around to grab something, and the whole room has no idea that this person, for that just split second, is probably obstructing, and it's like they don't have a clue on this idea that they're not breathing effectively. I mean, just
because the pulse ox is still fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so much that we think about and are trying to anticipate and don't want laryngospasms. And there's so much stuff that, because it goes well, mm-hmm. It's probably because you put all that energy into preparing and being, trying to avoid those issues. But I completely agree that there's, we've made it so good for so many that it gets, overlooked and unappreciated. When things don't go bad, people don't realize how much went into it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So with that, then, I mean, you're in a stressful specialty that everybody else doesn't think is so stressful, that you're hyper vigilant all the time, that when you leave and you go home, even if it was a quote unquote good day, you want to crash. Then you decide to start a podcast. So
yeah. Well, you know what it is, and I realized this of myself early on. I've always had other interests, and one thing that I try to highlight with Doctors Unbound with my podcast is that, we as physicians are three-dimensional people. We have other interests. We have other things going on. We have other things that we excel at. And I've always had kind of these other interests, these other passions, things that I've wanted to get into. And so for me to feel fulfilled, whatever level that is, I don't know if professional, semi-professional, entrepreneurial, whatever you want to call it. It's just something that I had to explore. And it's really cool. I think that like in today's day and age, the three of us can be in three different cities all across the country, and we can sit here and have this conversation, and connect and meet and hopefully bring some value to other people. So I've always wanted to explore that, and it kind of, I happen to do it with things related to physicians and physician issues and other things physicians are doing. But yeah, I think it just stems from what I need to feel fulfilled. And medicine, is a great field. It's a privilege to be able to take care of people. I don't want to minimize that. But it is stressful, and there are other things that, I've always wanted to explore.
Yeah, I think that, great privilege, great responsibility. So I think that's definitely, that puts the stress on us. I'm curious, when you started exploring the podcast, from that point until now, I'm not sure what that time frame is, but was there a shift in how you experienced your anesthesia work, or how did the anesthesia work shift, if it did at all, when you started putting time into the podcast?
I'm not sure if there's a shift with the anesthesia work, but I think it's just a shift of me and my thinking, and the things that I found are important, and I think I've mentioned this one other time. I think the seed was kind of planted with Dr. Cuccaro, because at some point when I was leaving the Navy, he mentioned the 4-hour work week. And I would have never picked up that book because the palm tree on the cover it looked so scammy. I hadn't heard of Tim Ferriss. I didn't know who it was. So I would have never picked up that book by myself. And he's like, dude, just forget the cover, just read the book.
That sounds like Kevin.
And I'm glad he told me that, because I read that book and I finished it pretty quickly. And I was like, and it really opened my eyes to this, to this idea of utilizing the internet and scaling something. And then I started thinking about, how can I apply that, within the things that I know and I'm good at, kind of stacking these skills. And it started, the initial foray into this kind of world was a website that was kind of informational for patients. And it was just like a buddy and I noticed that we'd get a lot of patients come into for surgery who were super scared about anesthesia. And a lot of times there's the things that they were scared about, were things that could have probably been alleviated with a little bit better information. Mm-hmm. And, I would ask them, they'd had their, elective surgery planned for a couple of weeks. They're like, yeah, I haven't been able to sleep for the last week or so. I've just been worried about this. And I'm like, well, what have you done? Like, well, I would Google this and I'd Google that. And so I started Googling those topics and realizing there was just a bunch of crappy information out there. And so a friend and I got together, said, well, let's create a website, from anesthesiologists, with informational things about anesthesia, its side effects, things like that. And so that was the first foray into this thing. And it was very scary to think that, what was the world going to think? What were my partners going to think? What would other anesthesiologists think? And a lot of that is in our head. So if anybody's listening and they've got an idea of a project or something, I would just say, just do it, because a lot of the limiting beliefs are in your head. And, a lot of the more senior people in my group, when they found out about it, because we didn't just broadcast it, we kind of figured we would, do it and didn't ask, ask for forgiveness later, so to speak. But a lot of people were like, dude, good job. I've always thought about something like that, but I never got past the idea phase. So that's kind of been on the back burner. A lot of times I don't actively maintain it or anything like that, but it was important because it kind of gave me permission to do something online. It took away some of the fear. If you haven't done something yet, I think especially as physicians, we want something to be perfect before we show it to the world. And you just can't do that in business, in entrepreneurship, in podcasting. And I remember my first couple episodes of my podcast, 2017, I recorded it. I had my wife listen to them before I hit publish, and she's like, "You're not very good." And I appreciated that honesty because she was right. I wasn't very good. But you know what? My response was yes, but I'm going to get better. And I knew that if I put in, 20 episodes, that at 20 episodes, I would see significant improvement. And, and now we're over 100 episodes, been going for 3 years strong, and I've missed one Monday in almost 3 years. And it's been one of the most fulfilling things for me because I get to connect with people like you. I've connected with over 100 physicians and other professionals in the healthcare space. And I've learned one or two nuggets at least from every person that I've interviewed. And those things kind of stick with you. So even beyond what the podcast has done for other physicians, and what potential it has as far as, monetization or brand or what have you, I know it has changed me in a much better way. And I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah. And I want to touch on that because we're in this sort of crisis, this physician burnout crisis thing. And one of the things, the purposes for the Change Physician is there's so many people going, I should never have gone into medical school. I've never should have been a doctor. I shouldn't have gone to medical school. This was such an awful choice. And I would challenge that and say, well, what we need to be doing is just thinking differently about how you can apply this stuff. So how do you find fulfillment and meaning in your practice or life? You can either do it by optimizing your practice, or you can do it by optimizing your learning in another field, which you've done with Doctors Unbound, and I'd forgotten about anesthesia myths, but when you're starting with this stuff, it's because no one else can do what you've done with Doctors Unbound because they don't have the background that you have. And every physician out there, we have these unique backgrounds. We have a unique perspective based upon our training. And it would be it's just neat to see that there's physicians that are leveraging this. And so for you, I was kind of, how have you balanced this? You've had this fulfilling podcast on the side you've been just so consistent and so persistent with that. What we didn't talk about was, I think you have four kids, right? And they're all under the age of what again?
They're all 7 and under.
Okay, so 4 kids under the age of 7. So when you started this podcast, they were 4 and under, and I think there was at least one that was.
I think we had 1 or 2, I think, back then. 2.
Yeah. So then how did you balance element? Because you're in anesthesia, and then you're starting this podcast in which you are consistent and very persistent with your publication schedule. Plus you have all these little people, and I know the people are listening is like, I only have a toddler, and how are you saying I do this stuff? How did you balance those issues?
So there's a couple of things, and it boils down to people and systems. And the number one person is my wife. She realized that this was something that was important for me professionally, fulfillment wise, and all that kind of stuff. And if she wasn't on board with it, then it wouldn't have been possible because I wouldn't sacrifice that relationship. But she's been incredibly supportive. Like right now, today I've got a lineup of a couple podcasts and an important phone call, and she understands that, I need this time. And so she's, taking care of the kids and making sure they're not coming knocking on my door and all that kind of stuff. And so if I wouldn't have buy-in from her about, what I'm trying to accomplish with this and kind of how that fits into the grand scheme of our family and things like that, then, and my own personal well-being and health. Right. And if you love your spouse, you want them to be fulfilled. Right. So, we support each other in that way, and it's amazing. So it starts there. And it goes on to being willing to pay for the support and the systems to take things off my plate. So my first 6 months or so of the podcast, I was doing everything. I purposely chose Monday morning as a publishing schedule, not because there was something magical about Monday morning. Probably most people in the podcasting space at the time said publishing Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday was probably better. But I chose Monday because I figured that most weekends, if I wasn't on call, I would have the weekend to catch up. And so I was using, Sunday night to edit my podcast or to put together show notes and things like that. And after doing that for about 6 months, I could see the kind of toll it was taking, on my personal time, on my family time. And I was like, am I willing to put some money into this to make sure that I'm progressing and putting out something of quality, and then using that time to have more time with my family? And so everything, I tell people everything is a trade-off. You might be at a point in your career, if you're earlier on, if you're a med student or something like that, where you don't have the money, but you have, the time. Maybe not when you're a med student, maybe before that, but where you just have to put in the time, because you can find a lot of stuff online. You can teach yourself to do almost anything. The question is it worth your time? And with a anesthesiologist's, salary and what I can earn doing an extra case or something like that, what is my time worth is a different conversation now versus, when I was a medical student. And then also with a family, like you said, with young kids, what is that time worth? So I was willing to hire people to now take the editing off my plate, to take the show notes off my plate, to take all of the other things off my plate that I knew I would not be able to be consistent if I didn't find help. And so you have to kind of be realistic with yourself. I think there was some benefit in doing it all myself early, because I can appreciate what it takes. And I know enough of it. Like if there's an emergency, I can do it myself. And I can value that service a little bit better. So I think there's a lot of benefit in doing it myself early, but then at some point, if you want to grow, if you want to scale, you have to take certain things off of your plate. You have to think more entrepreneurial. And that's hard for us to do as physicians. We feel like we're the only ones who can do it. Guess what? Like, I didn't enjoy editing. As soon as I handed it off, I was like, oh my gosh, they're doing a way better job than I was. I was so happy to get that piece off my plate. So.
And I think that's another resource that we have as physicians, right? So if you recognize that as a physician, no matter what your practice is like, you are going to have a much stabler income and resources than most people don't have. You can explore these side projects, do what you did, where you kind of immerse yourself in it, see if it's something that you enjoy, but then you have the resources then to invest in to give you your time back. And I do think that's an important consideration, because there are few professions that have really the income that a physician, the lowest paying physician, we'll assume pediatrics, who sometimes are under $100,000, but that's still better than most Americans. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of allow yourself to see that as a funding stream now, to start bankrolling these side projects that are providing you fulfillment, that you maybe are leveraging new learning with, and it changes your perspective then on your practice. So I'd be curious, has your podcast then changed how you see your anesthesia practice?
I think it's changed certain elements of it. For example, I hope I'm a better communicator, having talked to so many people. So, as you both know, as anesthesiologists, a lot of times we have a very short amount of time to connect with a patient, to put their fears at ease, to answer their questions, and really, really make that connection. So I think from that sense, podcasting has definitely been, has been very, very helpful. So that's just one small example, but I think it's super important.
Well, I think that the other part I was trying to get at with that is we oftentimes will feel trapped because we're physicians, like there's nothing else that we can do, that the only answer that we have is the traditional practice, where we're submitted to the whims of administration or the healthcare system, the big monsters there. But I guess the perspective fish I was kind of wondering about is, as you have put this time in, and you've put a significant degree of time, you started in 2017, mm-hmm. We're 3 years into this, or 2.5 years into this thing. And so that's a big chunk of time, but it's not 10 years of necessarily medical training. And as your podcast has become more and more successful, has that provided you, do you feel more or less trapped then by your physician degree? I guess that's what I was.
I it's changed a couple of things. Number one, my mindset. Again, like you said, realizing that there's so many avenues for physicians to do other things. And at the time of this recording, I haven't released this episode yet. By the time you release it, it may already be out on my podcast. But I just recently recorded with Dr. Rael Mazansky, who's one of the founders of Dropout Club. They now call it DOC Jobs. They're kind of moving away from the tongue-in-cheek Dropout Club. But obviously, if you're not familiar with it, it's docjobs.com. It's a very successful site that pairs physicians with other jobs in industry, whether that's finance, whether that's pharma, all sorts of different jobs. And in speaking with him, he went through this during 3rd and 4th year of medical school, where he loved the science, but as soon as he got on the wards, he realized that a clinical career in medicine wasn't for him. And on the podcast, he tells a story of having to basically reinvent himself. He finished med school, but then had to reinvent himself and figure out what he was going to do. And eventually, he creates DOC Jobs, which is very successful. And that's part of it is the mindset. We as physicians think we're only good at this one thing, but we have so much expertise and knowledge that allows us to do other things. It wasn't the primary reason why I created the podcast, but I'm a firm believer that, the past is kind of like writing on a CV. I'm a good communicator, work well with others, blah, blah, blah. But the new way of doing things is to show it, right? So, let's say I want to go interview for a position. I have a body of work that's almost 3 years long. Say, hey, you want to hear how I communicate? You want to hear how I can lead a project or something? Like, here it is. I've been doing it for 3 years. I think that's much more powerful and impactful than just writing it down on a resume.
No,
Yeah.
Absolutely, totally agree. Yeah,
there's so much proof of a lot of things, and I really I appreciated what you said earlier about just appreciating the work it takes in order to have this type of development of a podcast, and learning how to delegate, which some
it's
of us. Type A personalities that I want to get it done, or you want it on your timeline, or you feel like you can tend to the detail. And I actually like editing, but I know at some point there'll be somebody else we can delegate that to. But thinking of back then when you were going into medical school and what you know now, how would you say, or what would you tell yourself? Maybe you have a little bit different perspective, or maybe a fair warning or suggestions to your younger self, what you should know.
Yeah, so as far as like specialty, I think I couldn't see myself doing any other specialty. I think one piece of advice, which, so for me, I didn't have much financial training coming up. And, my parents practiced very sound personal financial principles. So, we learned basic stuff like, hey, don't carry a balance on your credit card, live within your means kind of stuff. But I think for physicians, if you have a little bit of an understanding of personal finance and do not allow yourself to get, let your lifestyle to expand or other things, and try to have a sound financial plan and life, then it will really allow you to have more choices down the road if you find yourself in a tough situation. I think part of burnout, not the whole thing, but I think part of it is physicians are graduating with more and more student loan debt, and they're getting out into the world, and they're getting into these positions where they don't feel that it's the best for them, but they feel trapped. And part of that trapping is financial, because they're looking at like, I've got $400,000 in debt, and I need this job. And so I think if there's one thing that I wish I knew even more, was to kind of get my financial training even earlier on.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are missing certain key features in our medical education, finances being a big one.
Yeah, I think we forget that. That's we've all lived as residents,
yeah.
Right? And if you could live a happy lifestyle as a resident, is just to make sure that you don't then escalate that, because you already know what it is your kind of minimum level is.
Mm-hmm.
And we then become victims of oh, we need to go buy a house right away, right after, as soon as we leave. And some of us were guilty of doing that stuff. But anyway, I think that's a great perspective. So I got a question for you, though, as we kind of wrap this interview up. And if you're reflecting then back on your physician journey, and we know there are a lot of different books and resources, and I know you read a lot and you've read a lot of different things. But thinking about someone who may be new to this, a physician who may be struggling with deciding what to do or feeling trapped in their practice, is there a specific book or resource that you would recommend to them to read?
Sure. And, a lot of people, subscribe by Rich Dad, Poor Dad or Cash Flow Quadrant. And I read those a long time ago. And, the book that I'm going to recommend, I think, kind of expounds a lot upon, the cash flow quadrant type stuff. And it dovetails to the previous question, which is, are financial literacy and physicians having much more control of their finances and being in a much better financial position? But there's a book by MJ DeMarco. He has two that I'm aware of. The first one is The Millionaire Fast Lane. Again, scammy title, but it was really a very good book. And then he has a second one, which I think goes into his theory on entrepreneurship, if you will, in a lot more detail. And it's called Unscripted. And it's a pretty long book. I think the audio version was around 8.5 hours. And I finished it so quickly at the beginning of this year. And then after I finished it, I wanted to have the hard copy. So I went and I bought the hard copy. And I think if physicians read that, it will change your mind a little bit and start thinking more from a financial standpoint, from the standpoint of business ownership, building companies, building systems, building assets that can pay you without requiring your time. As physicians, most of us still have that element of we're pretty highly paid hourly workers, but we're still trading time for money. And that allows you, that does allow you the ability, if you learn how to manage your finances, to escape by saving and then using that money to invest in assets, whether that's businesses, real estate, whatever you like to do. But this book really kind of breaks it down and spells it out for you. And it was so eye-opening for me. And it really kind of changed my mindset a lot in thinking more along the lines of being an owner, owning businesses, owning real estate, being an investor, and focusing myself, as Kiyosaki does in his cash flow quadrant, on the right side of the equation, which is businesses and investors, versus being on the other side of the equation. So that's the book that I would recommend for any physician that is thinking about starting something online, has any kind of entrepreneurial bent. Even if you don't, even if you're an employee, if you realize there's this whole other game out there that is being played. And even though we may make a lot per hour, man, there are people that have created systems and they are earning, so much money basically on autopilot. And it's not just for the love of money, right? But you can do a lot. Once you have that money, then you can do a lot of great things depending on, what your interests are. And I would hope that a lot of physicians there are great people that have a lot of great ideas, and they can churn that income into a lot of good for society.
Yeah,
that's great.
Absolutely. And again, that kind of returns to this idea of, which has come up over and over again, is what you're choosing to spend your time in these active choices, because that shifts the perspective. If you're trapped in a practice and if you're trapped, no one's trapped in a practice because we don't have slaves.
Right.
But if you're perceiving yourself to be trapped in that practice, even recognizing that, you read Unscripted by MJ DeMarco, and you start seeing this shift in perspective. Now you may be going that same practice every day, but then if you're redirecting that income stream in a way that makes sense to you, and you can see that you're investing in assets that changes the dynamic of the work environment. It changes that perception again, because now you're not necessarily trapped per se. Instead, you are using that practice to create a different income stream. And that perspective shift can be huge from a stress standpoint. So you've mentioned that book to me a couple of different times here, and I'm going to go buy it today, because every time you say it, I'm like, God, I got to buy that book if Dave is recommending it. But that's Unscripted, so I will be purchasing that today. Melissa, do you have any final thoughts on this?
No, I'm sure I could go another 30 minutes on some other stuff, but I think, no, all this is wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks, David, for joining us today. This is Dr. Dave Draghinas of the Doctors Unbound podcast. A friend of mine from the Navy days, and I'm so glad that you brought those stories up because it made me think about those moments of time. That was a lot of fun, actually.
It was. I look upon it fondly, and I just wanted to say, hey, I'm always excited when I hear doctors, doing things. Especially things like podcasting, YouTube channels, things like that, getting out their message. I think we need more of this. And I kind of thought this was going to happen 3 years ago when I started my podcast. And I think this year I'm seeing an acceleration of that. And I love that. I love seeing doctors using their expertise, combining it with their soft skills and putting out so much goodness into the world. And I'm excited for this project that you guys are doing. I'll have to, get you guys on my podcast at some point. We're creating a network with that podcast. So we're going to have a doctor's podcast network with a bunch of other podcasts on there and promoting physicians that are doing awesome things. So I'm excited for what this podcast is going to do. And I'm excited to be a guest on here and to support you guys.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for coming. And everybody else out there, stay well.